So I'm going to talk about the influence of sensory deficits and social cognition on spatial perspective taking, what you call visual spatial. But why do I call it spatial? It's because I'm going to use a tactile task. So maybe there are visual spatial processes involved. So this is now very trivial to you. So information can be perceived from a variety of spatial perspectives. And this diversity is central to effectively interacting with our environment and other people. And first, objects can be experienced from the perspective of the self. And this egocentric perspective, it was less talked about today, but it can be anchored to the location of the body as a whole, or it can be anchored to body parts, such as the head, the trunk, or an effector used to perform an action. Second, we can use a decentralized perspective or an actor-centric one. And finally, for navigation task, we can use an allocentric perspective. And the perspective we adopt on stimuli can also evolve over time. We might, for instance, perceive a stimulus from an egocentric perspective. And then, when interacting with someone, we might switch to a perspective that is decentered from the self and the body. And this perspective-taking process is crucial to understanding how the world is perceived by others and to distinguish the self from the other. So from this, many questions can be asked. Which perspective is naturally adopted? A question which has been raised a lot today. What are people's abilities to switch perspective, which is something that is far more overlooked? Is it an embodied process? And then I'm going to ask, do these abilities change as a function of sensory factors, such as visual and proprioceptive deficits? And do they change as a function of social or individual factors? So this is the roadmap. So to answer these questions, in my lab, we used the graphesthesia task. So here, the participants wear on their stomach a tactile belt with an array of 9 vibrotactile stimulators, a 3x3 matrix, that vibrate in sequences to spell out the letters B, D, P, or Q. And same thing for P and Q. So this is the tactile version, classic visual spatial task. And then the participants are presented with the letters, and they have to report using a keyboard which stimulus they perceived, and the answers they give below inferring the adopted perspective. So for instance, let's say that the letter B from my perspective in front of you is traced on your stomach. If you perceive a D, this means that you took a trunk-centered perspective. If you perceive a Q, you took a head-centered perspective, as if you were bending to see your stomach. And if you say it's a B, then you adopted a decentered perspective, here my perspective. So what is interesting here is that for the egocentric perspective, we have a way to disentangle between trunk-centered and head-centered perspective. And the idea is that we suspect that in formal literature, most of the perspectives that were head-centric were maybe taken for a decentered one, and there were anyway confusions. So across all the experiments we conducted, the participants all the time had a first session in which they were free to adopt the perspective that is the most natural to them. So in other words, they were just asked to report the letters they felt without any constraints. And we compiled the results across all experiments, that is on 250 participants. And as you can see on the graph on the right, half of the participants adopted a trunk-centered perspective, a third a head-centered perspective, and 20% a decentered one. So there is a variability for the natural perspective. And then the next question is this perspective natural? So in the first experiment, the participants completed 3 sessions. In the first one, they were free to adopt the perspective they wanted, as in the graph I just showed you. And in sessions 2 and 3, a perspective was imposed to them, either the one they previously chose or a different one. And this order was counterbalanced to disentangle between learning effects and switching costs. So what is interesting here is that we measure not only the default perspective, but also the ability to switch from one perspective to another. So the results first show a decrease in reaction times with block, a basic training effect. Second, there's a cost, longer reaction times when changing from preferred perspective to the opposite one. And then participants are faster when coming back to the preferred perspective. So here you do not have a switch cost. From this, we inferred that the perspective that the participant chose in the first session is natural and not a simple arbitrary choice. In addition, we found a difference in cost as a function of the natural perspective. It appears to be easier for people that naturally adopt a decentrate perspective to switch to an egocentric one than the other way around. So to summarize, our graphesthesia task allows investigating the default perspective and the flexibility in switching perspective, and the results show an important inter-individual variability in both. And I'm going to ask you to remember this paradigm as we're going to see it again just after the next slide. But to confuse you, we did a slightly different paradigm meanwhile. Because now we know that it's likely that the adopted perspective is natural, and the subsequent question is it an embodied process? So here, the participants were specifically required to adopt a head-centered perspective. And they were presented with the same ambiguous letters VDP and Q on 8 different bodily locations. So the back and front of the trunk, the right and left of the trunk, front and back of the thigh, and front and back of the shin. So the letters VDPQ, and here we measured their reaction times. And we thought that the head-centered perspective is particularly interesting for investigating embodied perspective taking, as it consists of mentally rotating the head toward the stimulated surface. So it involves mentally changing body posture. So from the results, we can see that adopting a head-centered perspective on the body is easier for surfaces that can be easily looked at with real movements, such as the front of the trunk. It is harder for surfaces that are far away from the head, such as the shin. It's also harder for surfaces that are physically impossible to be directly looked at, such as the back, or necessitating a greater quantity of movement, such as the front of the shin. So overall, these results support the embodied nature of perspective taking, and they show that mentally taking a spatial perspective on our body involves a mental change in body posture, which is influenced by physical body parts. So then we investigated spatial perspective taking abilities as a function of sensory factors, so, as I said, visual and proprioceptive deficits. So here, for the influence of vision, we ran the graphesthesia protocol, the first one I presented you, with 3 groups of participants: early blind, late blind, and blindfolded sighted. So we had 25 early blind, 32 late blind, and 28 blindfolded sighted. And as in the first experiment, the participants completed the 3 sessions, 1 free to adopt the perspective that is the most natural to them, 1 imposed with their chosen perspective, and 1 imposed with a different perspective. And in addition, we compared the results from this experiment with those we previously obtained in the non-blindfolded sighted participants, the one I showed you on the first slide. So results. First, less decentered coordinates were adopted by the early and late blind compared to the sighted blindfolded. This suggests that blindness reduces decentered spatial processing. Second, any condition without vision, early blind, late blind, and sighted blindfolded, biases toward a head-centered perspective. Thus, even a temporary lack of vision promotes the adoption of egocentric spatial coordinates. And finally, the early blind had a greater cost of switching perspective compared to the sighted. This suggests that early visual experience is important for flexibly changing perspective. Finally, there was no difference in switching costs between sighted and late blind participants. So we can thus see that there is an influence of vision, both on the perspective that is adopted naturally and on the ability to switch perspective. We then turned to the influence of proprioception. So here we used a manual drawing on the head, and we did that because in the study we conducted, it was done with 2 different patients that have neither tactile nor proprioceptive sensation below the head. So we couldn't use our tactile matrix, and we did that. And former studies in controls showed that the orientation of the perceiver is between head orientation and body orientation. So we used this paradigm. And here, similarly, in the 2 different patients and in the control group, the ambiguous letters BDPQ were manually drawn on the forehead, left and right surfaces of the head. And this was done when their head was oriented forward, leftward, and rightward. So first, in the controls, our results are in line with that of the literature. The adopted perspective varies with body posture, and the orientation of the self is a combination of trunk and head orientation. And this is not what is obtained with different patients. With them, there was no effect of the stimulated body surface and no effect of head orientation. So one of them always adopted an egocentric perspective, and the other one always adopted a decentered perspective. So it looks as if the orientation of their self is not influenced by their physical body. It can be the case that the 2 different patients relied on different strategies, egocentric and decentered. And then it might be the case that when internal information coming from the body is lacking, more cognitive strategies are adopted based on thinking about the body rather than feeling it. However, this was done with 2 participants, so of course we need more data to confirm this hypothesis. So here we saw that a loss of input in one sensory modality affects task performance in another sensory modality. And this can reveal a great deal about the functional architecture of sensory systems. And in a recent review we did with Lewis here and Xavier, we discussed the pattern of results from studies on sensory impairments beyond blindness and proprioception, and how that affects performance on tasks of perspective taking. So here, basically, people with visual impairments are better than controls in egocentric tasks and worse in allocentric tasks. People with vestibular impairments are worse in egocentric tasks and have same performance when they are required to adopt a decentered perspective. For proprioception, we just have the study we conducted and we need more participants. And finally, people with deficits in audition are better than controls for the allocentric task and equals when they are requested to adopt a decentered perspective. So here we can see different patterns as a function of sensory impairments. Finally, we wanted to investigate the link between spatial and social perspective taking. So we ran the graphesthesia task, again the first one, with the matrix of vibrators on the stomach in a group of participants, still the same. They had 3 sessions, one free, one imposed with their preferred perspective, and one imposed with a different one. And the participants also completed additional scales, one measuring social intelligence and one measuring attachment style. So this scale model attachment along 2 dimensions labeled attachment anxiety, characterized by a fear of interpersonal rejection and abandonment, and avoidance, characterized by an exaggerated sense of independence and emotional distancing from others. So regarding social intelligence, higher scores in social information processing were associated with more egocentric responses in the free session. So this suggests that the ability to understand and predict information regarding social relations is related to a strong natural perspective. A stronger benefit of returning to one's natural perspective was associated with higher social intelligence. Regarding attachment style, greater cost of switching to a natural perspective was associated with lower self-reported anxious attachments. And in fact, as the majority of the participants adopted a self-centered perspective in the session, this can suggest that higher levels of attachment anxiety may bias participants to more frequently adopt others' perspective, possibly reflecting their need to take into account how others perceive them. So in summary, a strong grounding in one's natural perspective is associated with lower interpersonal anxiety and higher social intelligence. So to summarize what I've said, the perspective adopted by default are natural with inter-individual variability. As we saw by default, 50% trunk, 30% head, and 20% center, and also a variability in the ability to switch perspective. There's an influence of vision. The lack of vision being permanent or temporary biases toward an egocentric perspective. There is an influence of proprioception. In the deafferented patients, the adopted perspective is not influenced by stimulus location and body orientation. And there is an influence of social skills and attachment style on spatial perspective. And now for the next step, and it's to continue on what Earl said, we are also interested in investigating the extent to which there's a link between spatial and social perspective taking, but with the hypothesis, that we're right, that social perspective taking abilities are grounded on spatial perspective taking abilities. So actually what we do is that we investigate jointly performance in spatial and social perspective taking tasks, both in neurotypical as well as in people with schizophrenia and ASD. And Alexandra tomorrow will talk about that. So these are my collaborators on this topic, and I thank them, and I thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot. Why do you think the early blind have been more egocentric, head-centric, since they don't rely on vision, the vision is head-centric? So I guess maybe it's audition, because it's also head-centric. Is that maybe the most plausible explanation, or maybe there is something else?
It is the result we have the most difficulty to interpret.
Okay.
Really tough. And it's after discussing with them a lot, says that they use a lot of tactile interfaces like this, and this might bias us toward this perspective.
Okay.
But otherwise, simply considering how there's the extent to which there's an influence from other sensory modalities, it's very tough. So if you have better explanation.
Well, just
this one is good, the use of tactile interfaces.
Yeah, that's good.
I might also have one. If they read with their fingertips, the farthest from them is the high of the letter, and the closest is the bottom of the letter. So if they look at the alphabet, it's the same way.
It's the same, yes.
And because they read with their fingertips, it makes sense. Will be used to follow it.
it totally makes sense.
A question with the vestibular inputs. When your data was that manipulated, because vestibular information is really very intriguing in this context. Yeah. So is it does it come under proprioception in your data, or vestibular?
It's not me that did that, but there was a study conducted by Christophe Lopez and Patrick Haggard, and they did vibrations of the internal ears, if I'm correct.
Okay.
And they used manual drawing of the letters beeping. And when they disturb the vestibular system, people tend to adopt more egocentric responses.
Yeah. We found that
they tend to adopt more eccentric responses. Sorry.
Okay.